Good evening from New York. I'm Dan Rather with news, analysis, and commentary. Tonight, Sean Hannity, star of Fox News, became a part of President Trump's legal battle, coming off the sidelines and finding himself on the field in a New York courtroom. The scene was an extraordinary showdown between lawyers for the president and lawyers for the law enforcement agency overseen by the president, the U.S. Department of Justice. At stake was a judge's order that President Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, reveal the names of his current and former clients. One of them, as it turns out, is Mr. Hannity. He admitted as much today he hadn't before, but he has not said what, if any, actual legal work Mr. Cohen did for him or does for him still, if any. On his radio program tonight, Mr. Hannity described the relationship as informal. He said he asked Mr. Cohen for occasional legal advice, but also was paying him nominal amounts, $10, he said, apparently to justify claiming attorney-client privilege.
I never gave him a retainer, never received an invoice, never paid any fees. You know, I might have handed him $10. I definitely want you attorney-client privilege on this, something like that.
The truth about Mr. Hannity's legal involvement may lie in Mr. Cohen's office documents, which investigators have now seized. Cohen's lawyers asked the judge to let a third party review the documents before prosecutors get a look at them. President Trump's own counsel argued that he, President Trump, should have the right to review those documents and decide which ones prosecutors could see. The judge told prosecutors to let Cohen's lawyers see the documents and advised the judge how many they think are subject to attorney-client privilege. Of course, mostly unspoken in all of this is Michael Cohen's ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, a possible presidential pardon. Just the prospect of its use by President Trump can embolden Cohen and his cohorts as they stare down special counsel Bob Mueller. And we cannot know whether it was coincidence or a signal when President Trump on Friday issued his latest and only third pardon of his presidency. As the vice tightens around those from Donald Trump's orbit since his campaign, you may wonder whether the president might try to pardon not just his allies, but even himself. And never mind the lawyers who say that is unconstitutional. The crimes, if there are crimes beyond the conviction so far, would appear to involve subversion of our democratic system and or obstruction of our justice system. In that light, it may be worth considering who Mr. Trump has pardoned so far. He's only pardoned 3 people. And if you squint a little, they barely register as 3 distinct lives because all 3 are men, all white men, all held positions in government, all 3 convicted of abusing those positions, and all 3 men were pardoned outside Department of Justice recommendations for ensuring that the mercy extended was the mercy of justice. All 3 received not the mercy of justice with its high regard for remorse and for victims, but instead the mercy of Trump, the narrow mercy of self-regard. First on the pardon list, there was Sheriff Joseph Arpaio. The sheriff's crime, contempt of court, refusing a judge's order to stop detaining suspected undocumented immigrants. Literally, a lawman accused of breaking the law, convicted of refusing to obey the law. Second, last month was former Navy sailor Christian Sosile, who took unauthorized photos of a U.S. submarine and then lied about it to law enforcement. The case offered a handy parallel for Mr. Trump during the campaign. As you recall, he argued jail time for Hillary Clinton over her use of private email. On Friday, just last Friday, we got number 3 on the Trump pardon list, Scooter Libby, former chief of staff to Vice President Dick Cheney. His crime? Perjury, lying to hide the truth from the law, the courts, the people. Libby's motive, apparently, was to cover up White House involvement in leaks intended to help the Bush White House and Cheney specifically justify the war in Iraq. Contempt for law, lying to the law, lying to the people. All 3 men pardoned by the mercy of Trump. A trinity, an outcome, if you will, far different from most of those convicted in American courts. And when you consider these 3 and their crimes, when you pull back and see the pattern and what they represent, the answer to whether President Trump might pardon himself is in some ways, in effect, he already has. Now, was President Trump's attack on Syria an attempt to wag the dog? I'll tell you why his own behavior toward the troops means we can't rule that out. That's next.
I see what we all see. The deep divisions, the endemic injustices, the uncertainty about our future. We have sometimes stumbled. We have sometimes fallen short. But we can renew our national purpose if we recognize that what unites us is far greater and stronger than all that divides us.
Look, we're doing interviews over there at youtube.com/TYT interviews, and we've done some amazing ones recently.
So now, of course, you know the person most widely considered to be the most progressive senator is Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Why not back him during the 2016 primaries? Why be a Democrat at all?
And we're in the time where you cannot, in good conscience, sit on the sidelines of history.
Let's be candid. When an accusation implies appalling moral character, it's tempting to shrink from it, to avoid contemplating the depth of the abyss. But anytime the President of the United States unleashes lethal military power, we as American citizens are obliged to ask why. As Americans wondered whether President Trump would do so as a distraction to wag the dog, on Friday he gave this explanation for his missile attacks on Syria.
Last Saturday, the Assad regime again deployed chemical weapons to slaughter innocent civilians, this time in the town of Douma, near the Syrian capital of Damascus. This massacre was a significant escalation in a pattern of chemical weapons use by that very terrible regime.
But think about it for a moment. If it's deterrence that motivates him, Mr. Trump did not explain why that escalation has occurred without other rebukes. Syria has used chemical weapons 50 times. If bombings really are a deterrent, why the wait? The president also invoked the horrible suffering of the victims of chemical warfare.
The evil and the despicable attack left mothers and fathers, infants and children thrashing in pain and gasping for air. These are not the actions of a man They are crimes of a monster instead.
But if it's compassion that motivates him, Mr. Trump did not explain why a man who would not give shelter to those gasping for air, would not let them breathe easy in freedom, or why Syrian suffering has only moved the Trump administration to admit 11 Syrian refugees this year. 11. When we ask why President Trump sent those missiles, we also have to ask what else he has sent. You probably didn't hear it on TV, but it turns out the answer is military contractors. As the Young Turks just reported, the Pentagon for the first time is now including Syria, along with Iraq, in the military census of its contractors. How many? We can't be sure. What they're doing? Also unclear. And we also don't know how many uniformed troops are in Syria. The Military Times reports now that the Pentagon is no longer releasing those numbers for Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, not just for today, but even for the past. Troop counts that were previously public, now erased. Troops already invisible on our TV screens, now deleted from even our public records. Now, it's one thing to withhold information about what you're doing or plan to do, but when you erase history, you have plunged deep into Orwellian territory. Whether we're talking Syria, your tax returns, or Russia, when you render the truth unknowable, you compromise our ability to make sound judgments. But in doing so, you destroy also, Mr. President, our ability to fairly judge you. You compromise the presumption of innocence. And as long as you unnecessarily hide this nation's actions and your own behind a cloak of secrecy, you expose yourself to suspicion of guilt. I want to talk next about House Speaker Paul Ryan and his legacy. But first, please, this short break.
All right, well, the Young Turks special election day coverage dropping. An amazing power panel. Look at this panel. You want to talk about power?
Like a smart Destiny's Child.
We're all too strong. We start a revolution. Yes, another one. Aren't you excited? Wow.
Some of the best writers in the country are right here on this panel, with the obvious exception of John Irola.
Let's not so quickly discount Harry Potter fan fiction.
We have elected the top Twitter troll in the country.
What ran me away from Christianity was judgment and condemnation.
Assaulting peaceful protesters in North Dakota, crazier than bombing Yemen, crazier than bombing Syria so much they ran out of bombs.
Reductive interpretation of what their motives are, what Putin's are, by these amateur experts is just beyond.
We don't kill our journalists, and they do.
A quick note, well, I hope you'll think it's quick, about Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, who says he's planning to retire at the end of his term in Congress. Mr. Ryan is a complicated figure. He fashioned himself a modest, small-town Wisconsin boy, deeply invested in economic policy. He spoke of himself as a moderate, while pushing ideas deeply at odds with the American society that built a vibrant middle class after World War II. One analysis by the 538 blog found that Ryan, as Mitt Romney's running mate, was further from the political center than any candidate on any presidential ticket in the previous 100 years. All those aspects came together in an interview that aired this weekend on NBC's Meet the Press. The speaker is asked about criticism, Republican criticism, of his recent legacy, which included massive spending, massive tax cuts, and a massive deficit. The speaker blamed regular rank-and-file Americans for wanting to retire.
This tax bill spiked the deficit. It's higher than even what was projected. And as We're looking at $1 trillion. You walk away with $1 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see.
That was going to happen. That the baby boomers retiring was going to do that. These deficit $1 trillion projections have been out there for a long, long time. Why? Because of mandatory spending, which we call entitlements.
We wanted to compare the tax bill's effect on the debt to that of baby boomers. It turned out that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget already did that. This is not, as you might imagine, any liberal group. They found that even with baby boomer retirements, America's debt increased only gradually over the next decade, still under 100% of America's gross domestic product. That's the bottom line. The upper line, forking off up top there, includes the loss of all that tax revenue, taking America's debt above that milestone marker, more than 100% of GDP. A complicated figure. Mr. Ryan began his career in Congress as an acolyte of Ann Ryan, who championed self-reliance. Like Mr. Ryan, she too benefited from government assistance. Mr. Ryan first declined to endorse Mr. Trump, then did endorse Mr. Trump, but then said he would not support Trump. He has told Dreamers, undocumented immigrants brought here as children, that they need not fear deportation, but pass no legislation to protect them. Ryan said Special Counsel Robert Mueller must be allowed to finish the Russia investigation, but will not pass a law to ensure that. A self-described fiscal conservative, his legacy is trillions more in national debt. A self-described defender of immigration, his legacy is Muslim bans and a border wall. An opponent of identity politics, he says, his legacy is civil rights rollbacks and racism empowered. Paul Ryan says he is leaving because he did what he came here to do. A complicated man.
I have given this job everything that I have, and I have no regrets whatsoever for having accepted this responsibility.
When Donald Trump was elected president, Republicans added the White House and the entire executive branch of government to their control of Congress and the legislative branch. When that happened, there were many opponents who warned, and this is a paraphrase of their quote, "You watch, they're coming for your Medicaid, Medicare, and eventually your Social Security," end quote. Well, those warnings ring anew and will no doubt be redoubled with the new executive order President Trump just signed. This executive order targets broad stretches of America's social safety net for millions of poor and not so poor Americans who rely on that net. The president told his agencies not just to enforce every regulation on the books that calls for work requirements, not only to renew and review all their waivers for work requirements, but also to look for new work requirements they can add. The administration has already started letting states strip Medicare from recipients who do not meet work requirements. Now we're talking about making it national policy for the whole country. With more than 74 million on Medicaid, and then you've got the 41 million who count on food stamps to eat and feed their families. That includes elderly people and the disabled, but most are children. Republicans have long cherished the idea of killing these programs, but President Trump's order goes beyond Medicaid and food stamps. It's also housing aid and more. He is mobilizing the entire federal government to seek out rationales to stop helping people. The argument is that government aid traps people in poverty. That's the basic rationale for what the president is doing. But studies show work requirements have little to no effect on poverty. Take food stamps, for instance. They don't end poverty, they end hunger. These requirements redefine government aid as something you have to earn. At that point, the entire point of government aid, helping those in need, becomes extinct. So now the point is to, quote, restore the independence and dignity that President Trump apparently thinks these struggling people lack. The dignity of work, empowerment, as the White House put it, quote, adding or enforcing work requirements for able-bodied adults on welfare is an effective solution to help millions of Americans regain their independence. Well, when you think about the dignity of work, you might want to know that on the day President Trump signed this order, his presidential daily schedule began at noon, meeting with the Emir of Qatar. Next, he hosted the Atlanta Crimson Tide football team on the South Lawn. That was 3:15 in the afternoon. It was also the last item on his work schedule for the day. Dignity. Now, when we come back, we got a copy of the Jim Comey book, and I have some thoughts about it. So stay here with us.
Do you trust the establishment media?
The United States economy has never been better. Monetary policy is spectacular.
Everybody thought Jamie Dimon was the king of Wall Street last week. Well, it might be Ken Lewis now. He takes the crown. The best sales force out there is Merrill Lynch, and now it goes to BofA. It's pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing. Lewis now. Buying opportunity. I do think this is a buying opportunity. We're going to see a stabilization and just a tremendous snapback.
The rally will be jaw-dropping.
The Occupy Wall Street movement is not a spontaneous protest against economic inequality.
This is what we mean by the establishment press.
It is a well-thought-out campaign.
To bring down the infrastructure of this country.
The embarrassment is that I'm given credibility in this world because of the disappointment that the public has in what the news media does.
I'm the former chairman of the Veterans Committee, and I've learned a little bit about the cost of war. What the president is trying to do, and I agree with him, is to do everything that we can without going to war.
So what do you say to your critics? I'm talking about Democratic critics who say, you know what, he's really just a socialist pacifist.
I very rarely read in any coverage of Bernie that he's a socialist.
Bernie Sanders is a socialist, for God's sake.
Most analysts are saying that Hillary Clinton's going to win in a landslide.
I continue to believe Mr. Trump will not be president.
I've got Trump at 279, 259.
Wait a minute. I know you don't believe that. Sorry,
We're not going to be polite anymore. You know what we're going to do? We're going to fight back.
Fight for a free and independent media. We're done with politeness. We fight back.
A few thoughts now about the bizarre duel between the president of our country and the former director of the FBI. It's not the role of reporters to try to fully assess a person's character. We report on deeds and words. Character is beyond our ability as humans to assess with confidence. So take these words as reflections on people not as they are, but as they have revealed themselves in the Oval Office and in the pages of A Higher Loyalty, the book of which I have a copy. Comey's self-portrait bears a striking resemblance to what we've seen of President Trump. Both men proclaim a deep hatred of politics. Donald Trump campaigned as the anti-politician, speaking impolitically of a nation in crisis, jobs, crime, immigration. I alone can fix it, he said. Time and again, some crisis demands his special action outside our norms to fix the country. Mr. Comey tells us he became a federal prosecutor precisely because the work was pure, free of politics. Mr. Comey rose as a protector of the Bureau's credibility, the FBI's reputation. Time and again, some looming crisis, in his view, demanded his special action outside the Bureau's norms to save his good name. Mr. Comey writes about the panic button he had at the FBI to summon his security detail. So fearful is he of the possible crisis of pressing that button in his sleep, so determined to do the right thing, he puts the alarm in a separate room where his wife accidentally hits it. Crisis arises from his extraordinary measures to avoid it. The perception of crisis justifies those measures again and again. Through the election and beyond, Mr. Comey's glimpse of future crisis justifies to him his special intervention, and always for the sake of the FBI's reputation. He alone can save it, in his view. Mr. Comey's book does indeed offer a cautionary lesson for future leaders, but not one he intended. If you wish to serve, to fix your nation, to save our institutions, do not imagine their norms are insufficient. Serve those norms, do not save them. And if you wish to preserve credibility, do not attempt to influence opinions of it. One reason reporters do not interrogate, try to assess character, is that motive is no guarantee of outcome. We and Mr. Comey will never know if the ego to which he confesses led him to an institution that let him endure himself in its purity. But we do know that anointing yourself its protector, perceiving threats to its reputation, threats that happen to demand your special intervention, is often a path to failure and self-destruction. There is, after all, a word for working to shape opinion, whether you want people to see America as strong or the FBI as credible. That word is politics. Finally tonight, all of the strum and drag about James Comey's explosive new book and President Trump's incendiary tweets about it, plus today's court maneuverings involving Mr. Trump's personal lawyer, bring back to mind something I've been thinking a lot about these past few tumultuous and perilous for the nation months, really for more than a year now. After listening to what it is I'm talking about, you may want to mull some or all of it yourself as your duty as a citizen, whether you're a Trump hater or a supporter or something in between. What it's about is something at the very core of our beloved nation, part of our national soul, and that is the rule of law, the importance of the rule of law, and two phrases that are keys to that. Number one, equal justice under the law. The other, number two, no man, no person, not even yea, especially a president, is above the law. These are fundamental and precious concepts, both American new ideas and ideals, in that ours is the first nation. We are the first people in history to embed them, perpetuate them, guarantee them in a constitution. Not that anyone believed in the beginning or believes now that they can or will ever be fully, completely, perfectly applied in practice. No, but we have always been dedicated to trying, seeing them as a navigational North Star, to be continually, forever moving forward toward coming closer. Equal justice under the law is inscribed in stone on our courthouses and other monuments to the rule of law to remind us that it is our goal. No man, no person is above the law has been repeated over the centuries by leaders of all parties and political movements, also to remind us. Now, we find ourselves once again at a tipping point in our history when we need to remind ourselves again, rule of law, equal justice under the law, and no man, no person is above the law. The judicial branch of our government, the courts, along with the Justice Department, including the FBI, have the primary responsibility of ensuring that these three parts of our North Star burn brightly, hold steady. But citizens, individually and collectively, have a crucial role in holding steady in support, regardless of partisan political beliefs or ideology. The future of our country and its place in history depend on it. And with that, I'll leave you for this news cycle. The Young Turks is next, and we'll be back with the news at this same place and time, 5:30 Eastern, every Monday. Until then, Dan Rather reporting. Stay steady.